In 1974, some farmers were digging a well when they struck a vast underground vault. Inside was a spectacular discovery: a terracotta army of several thousand warriors. Each of these fired clay figures stands more than 6 feet tall and weighs about 600 pounds. They all bear individual features, as if modeled after living men. As with any army, there are many types of warriors: infantry, archers, cavalry, charioteers, and different ranks from grunts up to generals. And these warriors are standing, kneeling, drawing bows, and driving chariots. The burial ground is found in Liyi, east of the ancient Qin dynasty capital of Shenyang, near modern-day Xi'an in China's Shanxi province. And the unearthed terracotta warriors were just the beginning. Since 1974, archaeologists have discovered an elaborate tomb complex, a necropolis for Qin Shi Huangdi, China's first emperor, who unified China's warring states and founded the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BCE. For the afterlife, the emperor needed palaces, temples, stables, kitchens, and audience halls. So it's not just soldiers, weapons, horses, and chariots that populate the necropolis. There are terracotta musicians and an entire clay circus troupe, complete with a strongman. This was entertainment for the afterlife and music for the rituals the emperor would continue in the hereafter. Arrayed around the tumulus, that's the grave mound, are the graves of imperial consorts and imperial officials, an eternal imperial retinue, as it were. So today we're going to explore daily life in China's first empire, the Qin dynasty, dates 221 to 206 BCE. We'll do so through the lens of this tomb and the lives of the artisans who mustered the terracotta army. But first, let me tell you about myself and my interest in Imperial China. For the last 2 decades, I've been teaching military history and strategic theory at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. It's an amazing job. It's my honor to hold that job. But I've been studying Chinese history and Chinese culture and the Chinese language for more than 30 years. That's what I received my PhD in. Creating this course was a chance to get back to my roots, an opportunity to read and reread some of the great books in the field. And I was fortunate to have been mentored by some of those great historians. I believe this course will be unlike any other you've ever taken in Chinese history. It's an intimate look into the lives of the people who inhabited Imperial China over the 2 millennia from 221 BCE all the way up till 1911 CE. I believe that knowing them and their times will also help you make better sense of China and the Chinese people today. I'm particularly indebted to Professor Philip Kuhn, a truly inspirational teacher who taught me first how to read and then how to write the history of Imperial China. One lecture in this course is based on Kuhn's brilliant book, Soul Stealers, the Chinese sorcery scare of 1768. I hope that I've lived up to his standards of academic rigor and intellectual curiosity, especially his curiosity about the humanity of his historical subjects. Another great teacher is Peter Bohl, whose book, This Culture of Ours, was my inspiration for a lecture on the literati or educated class of the Song dynasty, who reigned much earlier, from 960 to 1279. So let's dive into the lives of the people who inhabited Imperial China. Our first subject is China's first emperor, who comes off poorly in most history books. He's credited with unifying Imperial China, but is generally regarded as an overreaching tyrant. Just think about the title he chose for himself. Qin, Shi, which means the first and founding, Huang, luminous and august, evoking the indescribable beauty and powerful luminosity of heaven, and Di, the title of the god kings who created Chinese civilization. So it's Qin Shi Huangdi, the first and founding divinely luminous god king of Qin. We find a scathing account of his reign in a book called The Records of the Grand Historian, written in the 1st century BCE by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian. Among the emperor's alleged sins were murdering scholars by the hundreds and burning books by the thousands. This was in an effort to erase alternatives to the Qin dynasty's official philosophy of legalism, that is, an amoral doctrine of might makes right statecraft. Qin Shi Huangdi's image wasn't helped when Mao Zedong, one of the 20th century's most murderous tyrants, welcomed comparisons between his reign of terror and that of the first emperor. Recent scholarship, however, is challenging some of the conventional wisdom on the first emperor. For example, all those disappearing books and missing scholars might simply have been relocated to libraries and academies in the Qin capital, where their intellectual pursuits could be centralized and monitored. What we can say about the first emperor is that he ruled China with the same obsession for standardization and centralization, and the same mania for mass mobilization that he used to conquer China. But what was required to conquer China? Well, when the 13-year-old Yingzheng ascended to the throne of the state of Qin in 247 BCE, Qin was a kingdom, just one of 7 major powers called the Warring States. By 221, the other states were extinguished. Yingzheng and the Qin prevailed because his kingdom was mobilized for war through centralized bureaucratic control. Qin was supremely autocratic, in contrast with some other warring states that were still more like confederations of aristocratic clans. Qin was also supremely bureaucratic, meritocratic, and technocratic. Qin bureaucrats, selected and promoted on merit, systematically registered and taxed the dynasty's growing population and mobilized thousands of the empire's subjects for huge public works projects. Qin technocrats distributed advanced farm implements to spur production and plotted roads and designed vehicles to get the agro-surplus into state hands. The weapons and vehicles that poured out of state armories and the roads that radiated out from the capital thus translated Qin's internal innovations into military power that could be projected outward. Qin was also physiocratic. Agriculture was the foundation of state power. Farmers produced food and children, and the Qin did everything possible to encourage both. And finally, Qin was stratocratic. Yingzheng was a warrior king, and most of the state's immense power was channeled toward military conquest, the contest with the other warring states. All these traits were mutually reinforcing, shaping the daily lives of the Qin subjects. But the ultimate hallmark of Qin was standardization. As part of its own internal consolidation, the Qin standardized legal codes, weights and measures, axle widths, currency, and it introduced a simpler written script. And as the kingdom expanded, it used standardization to integrate newly conquered territories. To get a sense of the Qin state in action, let's think about its military, primarily the infantry. Hundreds of thousands of farm boys received the same arms and armor and the same training. And the bureaucracy was vertically integrated. The state owned the copper and tin mines, ran the smelting furnaces, and made sure that its smiths forged bronze weapons that met exacting Qin standards. The ancient bronze crossbow triggers unearthed with the Terracotta warriors are finely made, easy to operate, and their parts are interchangeable with triggers made hundreds of miles away. As a Qin soldier, you were like that trigger, just one of thousands of interchangeable mechanisms in a modular military machine. By building this bureaucratic war machine from top to bottom, King Yingzheng vanquished the other warring states. And it's for him that the Terracotta army was built. But before we get to the tomb complex at Liyi and to the Terracotta army, let's turn to China's first imperial capital, Shenyang in the Wei River Valley, the main east-west corridor from the North China Plain up towards the route we now know as the Silk Road. The Qin heartland was agriculturally self-sufficient and naturally defensible. It was a secure base for the dynasty's 4th century BCE period of consolidation and a base of operations for its 3rd century campaigns of conquest. When we look in during the 210s, it's being remade to reflect the stature of China's ultimate ruler. Shenyang means full of yang, full of masculine or martial vigor. It had been the Qin capital since 350. It was a walled city full of palaces. It housed the original Qin royal palace, along with replicas of the royal palaces of the 6 warring states that Qin had conquered. Symbolic. And there was a new Imperial palace. Across the Wei River, from the main city, was yet another project. This was the Epang Palace. The historian Sima Qian, who I mentioned a moment ago, and who was probably indulging in some hyperbole about the vanity of the first emperor, tells us that the Epang Palace required 700,000 laborers to construct. When it was complete, it boasted zoos, party pavilions, and a main hall that could hold 10,000 people. Shenyang also had homes for large numbers of government functionaries, and for 120,000 aristocrats the emperor had relocated there, basically as hostages. And Shenyang was home to many government officials. Qin was hyper-bureaucratic. It had ministries for rituals, taxation, agriculture, a ministry for horses, and of course, the ministry for writing and enforcing the law. There were other ministries for roads and walls, and of course, the war ministry. A bureaucracy that rewards merit does 2 things. It recruits the best and brightest, and it shatters competing loyalties. Feudal loyalties, clan loyalties, regional identities are all erased when your sole loyalty is to the emperor, and when he's the sole arbiter of your success in life. The capital city would have been full of these bureaucrats. If you were to travel outside the walled city of Shenyang through one of its immense gates, you would have crossed the Wei River to one of the several imperial highways that radiated out from the capital. To the north was the Straight Road, which ran 600 miles into what is now Inner Mongolia. The Eastern Highway was equally impressive, 150 feet wide, stretching beyond the horizon. All told, imperial roads covered about 4,200 miles. These thoroughfares extended the outward reach of the central government and facilitated the inward movement of produce, labor, and information. As for walls, after 221, the Qin demolished the walls that had divided it from the other warring states. And it extended an external wall on the northern frontier that marked the northern extent of the Qin's conquests. This was the precursor of a much later construction called the Great Wall. The route from Shenyang to Liyi, the burial grounds where the Terracotta army is found, it travels north of what would be the city of Chang'an, the future capital of the Tang Dynasty. That's from 618 to 907. It travels into the foothills of Mount Li. This was a densely populated and active route, livened by carts, porters, and many, many horses. You might see postal couriers and diplomatic retinues, along with military detachments on the move. You might even catch a glimpse of the emperor. Qin Shi Huangdi was famous for his imperial inspection tours. You'd also see a good deal of commerce, some private, but a lot of it for government projects. And you'd likely come across materials for the tomb complex. Pine timbers from Sichuan in the southwest, and vats of lacquer from the southeast with which to decorate the palaces and to paint the terracotta warriors. The most striking thing to behold on this trek up to Liyi would have been the farm fields. Great grids of fields, all precisely the same size. Remember that other than soldiering, the fundamental occupation in Qin was farming. In the 4th century, the Qin decreed that all agricultural land should be carved up as rectilinear grids. Grids of fields were demarcated by roads, and smaller family fields demarcated by footpaths. The acreage was based on how much a farming family could reasonably cultivate. This grid system facilitated imperial accounting. This is how officials got an idea of crop yields, of tax revenues, and of population. It was a form of social control. Think about it. You push the bulk of the population into a labor-intensive and sedentary occupation. The grids also break down family and local loyalties. They transform villages from organic enclosed communities into administrative units. And you replace kinship with government-mandated 5 and 10 family squads, a structure that mirrored the army. Qin technocrats also published farming manuals and experimented with new crops. And as we know from excavations near the Terracotta Army, state and private firms alike were pumping out all manner of iron farm implements. The state also maintained grain mills to process the crop. So we'd see great grids of millet fields stretching out on both sides of the Imperial Road, employing tens of thousands of registered taxpayers. And many of these new landowners out here are not natives. They're rather part of a Qin policy of mass relocation that encompassed all strata of society, from aristocrats to scholars and craftsmen, all the way down to these farm laborers. Imperial administration mirrored the physical gridding of the land. The empire was divided into 36 military commanderies, each subdivided into several counties. They were administered by direct imperial appointees. The overarching mission of the Qin was to break down regional identities and to make all people subjects of the emperor, first, foremost, and probably exclusively. About 20 miles from Shenyang, we'd arrive in the foothills of Lishan, Mount Li. It's an auspicious site famed for its gold and jade mines and its rich clay deposits. The abundant clay is why so many of these grave goods are made of terracotta. Yingzheng chose this site for his royal tomb soon after he became king. And Li is essentially a second imperial capital, a seat of power for the afterlife. In its own time, it would have looked every bit like a city of the living. It had 2 sets of rectangular walls, about 25 feet wide and about 30 feet high. The inner wall, which defined the emperor's personal space, was 3,000 feet by 1,500 feet. That inner sanctum was dominated by an immense pyramidal tomb, a tumulus. It was said to contain not just the casket and grave goods of the emperor, but a model of the entire world, laid out on the floor, with the imperial capital at its center. On the roof above, the heavens are mapped out, while on the floor, the seas and rivers of the earth course with liquid mercury. The massive outer wall of the necropolis surrounded support facilities such as kitchens, offices, and stables. They're full of activity. Sima Qian tells us that 30,000 households were resettled here to work on this project alone. So Li is a hive of industry, complete with armies of carpenters, painters, masons, in our case, potters. So let's look into the best preserved and most famous part of the complex. To the east of the tumulus, about a kilometer beyond the outer wall, is the Terracotta Army, more than 7,000 strong. The ancient Chinese saw the afterlife as a longer version of this life, including an analogous social structure and analogous daily needs like food, money, clothing, and tools. But why an army? Well, the first emperor was obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions across the realm to seek out alchemists and elixirs. But he was also hedging his bet. If immortality was beyond his grasp, he still had ample buy-in for imperial status in the afterlife. He expected That would give him privileged access to the forces of the divine. And with that, it might allow his dynasty to endure for generations, if not all eternity. The afterlife requirements of an emperor were immense. But people of all social strata in the Qin dynasty made similar, albeit less ostentatious, preparations for the afterlife. Officials believed they would play the same roles in the hereafter. Our craftsmen probably expected to be potters in the afterlife and would likely be buried with grave goods representing their daily needs, like tools. This continues to the present day with the use of ghost money and other funerary offerings used across Asia. It's a tradition of venerating ancestors and supplying them with the symbolic means to thrive long after death. For an emperor who'd unified China by force, an army for the afterlife makes sense. It's an army that faces east, ready to march out and assert Qin dominance over the dead kings that the first emperor had conquered in life. The emperor's tomb also reveals a good deal about the traditions and evolution of tomb building in China. Tomb building was a top priority for China's rulers. Tombs of the nobility became more elaborate during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, but this one really raises the bar. There was one positive development, and that was the gradual replacement of human and animal sacrifice with wood and clay figurines. There was some sacrificial killing at this site, especially of horses and of criminals, but nothing like the mass slaughter of enemy prisoners of war and the burial of wives and servants that marked earlier periods in Chinese history. An imperial entourage rendered in terracotta and backed up by an army in terracotta served Qin Shi Huangdi's vision for eternity. But how was this army constructed? Well, the answer to that gives us an idea of technology and the economy in early imperial China. Like almost everything else around the capital, the assembly and firing of the terracotta figures was run like the military, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and meritocratic. Success was rewarded and failure punished. And we can imagine that there was a lot of trial and error. For instance, a monumental terracotta, 6 feet tall, 600 pounds, well, something like that is prone to thermal shock. In other words, catastrophic failure when cold clay is fired in a kiln. If you were the craftsman that solved that problem, you would have been promoted and moved up the social ladder. The skilled artisans doing the fine work on the warriors were paid in imperial coin. They used standardized tools and measuring devices produced in government workshops. They traveled on government roads and worked in a regimented organization, and they lived in a regimented society. Moreover, many of these artisans have been relocated from all over the empire as part of the Qin's unification enterprise. Skilled potters in the hundreds would have been needed to convert clay from the foothills of Mount Li into terracotta attendants for the emperor. Thousands more were needed to make the roof tiles and plumbing works of the new imperial capital out of the same clay. And yet, for all that regimentation and standardization, the army that emerged from this process was remarkably diverse. No two figures are exactly alike, and this reveals a lot about the mechanics of making the terracotta army. The warriors were produced in mass, but they were not mass-produced. Even at a distance, the variety is apparent. In close, the variations are even richer. Facial expressions and body types all seem unique. The effect would have been magnified by the detailed hand painting of each statue. Since each warrior is different, some speculate that they're portraits of select members of the Imperial Guard. That's probably not the case. Instead, the variations arise from how they were made. First, there were as many as 100 different 10-man teams, each under a master potter. Each team produced subtly different body styles. Second, there's the assembly. A warrior was built from the bottom up. A rectangular clay plinth was molded and dried. Shod feet, which were also molded, were then added, followed by prefabricated legs. Those are basically clay pipes. The time-consuming phase was making the torso. Rather than using molds, torsos were gradually built up with coils of wet clay. So naturally, there's going to be a lot of variations in these torsos. Along the way, the armor and clothing are hand-tooled. Arms were then attached and tweaked to fit, as were molded heads and molded hands. The last phase before the warrior goes in the kiln was attaching and tooling hairstyles, facial hair, and head dressings. And the clay at each of these progressive attachments was still wet and worked by human hands. You can see how this modular production system would make each figure unique. All told, 100 squads at work here could produce a total of 700 warriors per year. There are 4 pits at the site. Pit 1, the famous one, contains a 6,000-man army. Pits 2 and 3 contain smaller contingents, including a command headquarters and a guard unit. Pit 4 is empty. Had the emperor not died in 210, it's easy to imagine another several thousand warriors filling that 4th pit. Variations in heat, humidity, and clay composition would also affect what came out of the kiln. Once each soldier cooled, another set of craftsmen would set to work lacquering him in brilliant hues. The completed warrior was then gingerly moved into position from the back of the pit to the front. The pit itself was covered by a huge wood and tile roof. Once in formation, a warrior was outfitted with real weapons, weapons captured from the Qin's vanquished foes. Now, repeat that process 7,000 times, and you've got a terracotta army. But why did this huge project remain a secret until the 20th century? Well, for one, construction at Liyi ended abruptly with the death and burial of the first emperor in 210 BCE. Workers then spent months burying the tumulus under several feet of dirt. For the next 4 years, the remaining workers maintained the tomb complex and saw to the ritual needs of the late emperor. But in 206 BCE, a rebel army stormed the capital. Qin Shi Huangdi's successor renounced the title of Luminous God King, and the Qin came to an end. It's said that the victorious rebels torched the tomb complex. As the palaces burned, along with the kitchens and the stables, the roof structure over the warrior pits burned and collapsed. The terracotta warriors lay hidden and unrecorded until 1974. The terracotta army is a microcosm of the short-lived Qin dynasty. The artisans at Liyi lived in a regimented society that was autocratic, bureaucratic, meritocratic, technocratic, physiocratic, and stratocratic. The decades of war that preceded the Qin unification transformed all the warring states into centralized bureaucracies, but Qin was the most centralized and bureaucratic of them all. That's why they were victorious. But at Liyi, the Qin dynasty came full circle. The techniques for manning and equipping a living army to conquer an empire were committed to creating an army for the afterlife. Qin was becoming a proto-industrial society. A large population, advanced technology, and a well-oiled bureaucracy made monumental feats of construction like this, and the roads and the walls, and the Qing agricultural system possible. But the Qin couldn't control everything. Not the variations between terracotta warriors, and certainly not the emperor's mortality. And the farther you got from Shenyang, and the farther you got from the imperial roads, the sharper the disparity between the ideal of order and the realities of a huge, diverse, and difficult to govern new empire. Moreover, the first emperor's obsession with regimentation and with massive public works projects rankled regional power holders who rose in revolt soon after his death. Perhaps the Qin had to fail for Imperial China to succeed. The Qin was the apotheosis of the bureaucratic and organizational revolutions of the Warring States period. It was the last warring state, but it laid the foundations of a durable empire and established a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial overreach in this life and in the next.